right, good evening. Welcome back to Faith Baptist Church. If you would take a hymn book, let's go to page 739 to start our service. 739. Why do I sing about Jesus? And if you're able, let's stand. We'll sing all three verses. Deep in my heart there's a gladness. Jesus has saved me from sin. Praise to his name, what a Savior. Cleansing without and within. Why do I sing about Jesus? Why is he precious to me? He is my Lord and my Savior. Dying, he set me free. Only a glimpse of his goodness, that is sufficient for me. Only one look at the Savior, then was my spirit set free. Why do I sing about Jesus? Why is he precious to me? He is my Lord and my Savior. Dying, he set me free. He is the fairest of fair ones. He is the lily, the rose. Rivers of mercy surround him. Grace, love, and pity he shows. Why do I sing about Jesus? Why is he precious to me? He is my Lord and my Savior. Dying, he set me free.
Great singing. Welcome back tonight. We appreciate you being here. And we appreciate these young men on the front row. They'll be leaving us this week and headed off, taking their energy with them, their excitement, their enthusiasm, taking it to camp. But before they go, I'm going to ask Jacob Philip in prayer for us tonight to start the service.
Heavenly Father, Lord, thank you so much for the opportunity we have to be in your house this evening, Father. I pray to use the time now to open up your word. I pray to do a mighty work, Father. I pray to guide pastors and to help us as the audience, as the listeners, to take in your word and to let it perfect us. We'll help be doers of it, and we praise you for it all. We love you. Thank you for everything you do. Amen.
Amen. You can be seated, page 696. 696, God leads us along, all three verses. In shady green pastures, so rich and so sweet, God leads his dear children along. Where the waters cool flow bathes the weary one's feet, God leads his dear children along. Some through the waters, some through the floods, some through the fire, but all through the blood. Some through great sorrow, but God gives a song in the night season and all the day long. Sometimes on the mount where the sun shines so bright, God leads his dear children along. Sometimes in the valley, in darkest of night, God leads his dear children along. Some through the water, some through the flood, some through the fire, but all through the flood. Come through great sorrow, but God gives a song in the night season and all the day long. Through sorrows befall us and Satan oppose, God leads his dear children along. Through grace we can conquer defeat all our foes. God leads his dear Page 705. 705, It Is Well With My Soul. And let's just sing all 4 verses. They're all good, so let's sing all 4 of these verses. When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. Though Satan should buffet, though trials should come, let this blessed assurance control, that Christ hath regarded my helpless estate, and has shed his own blood for my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well with my sin. Oh, the bliss of this glorious thought. My sin not in part, but the whole is nailed to the cross, and I bear it no more. Praise the Lord, praise the Lord, oh my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. And Lord, haste the day the clouds be rolled back as the scroll shall resound, and the Lord shall descend. Even so, it is well with my soul. It is well with my soul.
All right, before we do the offering, I want to thank those of you who are able to stop by for Camden this afternoon. And on behalf of his family, just want to say thanks for that. And I know he's thrilled about it and just feels appreciative for a church family. Some of you don't even know Camden that well. Some of you had to ask who Camden was in the room, but you still just wanted to be an encouragement, and appreciate you folks doing that. And one more next week for Johnny. And be in prayer about our next school year. We're 6 years down. We spent 2.5 hours today just meeting and discussing how we can make it better, and still trying to make things better. Put in a nice little demerit system for those girls in the back there, but looking forward to the demerit system. Might help things out a little bit, but always trying to improve. But God's been good to us, and we thank the Lord for our school year, and looking forward just to this summer. Don't forget, starting next week on Sunday nights, Sizzling Summer Sermons. All right, that was one of the titles that we were going to go with, but it didn't stick. But Sizzling Summer Sermons start tomorrow or next week, and Brad will be preaching that first one, so you want to be here next Sunday night for that. I'm going to ask Aaron if he'll pray for the offering.
Well, I was glad to see they come up with the title for what they're going to be doing the next few weeks, Sizzling Summer Sermons. And I'm glad you're here tonight to get the last of the fizzles instead of the sizzles. And so I got the fizzle tonight, so then next week they'll start the sizzle. I'm sure that'll work out. That's what my grandma used to say. We'd go pick corn by hand. She'd get one of them little bitty ones. It's just a fizzle, she'd say. So I remember that when he said that. This is a song that I actually sang a Dottie Rambo song earlier, but this one is another one of hers. But a good friend of ours used to sing this all the time when I was growing up, and it just kind of it seemed like a just regular hymn, but sometimes you get to think about folks going on to heaven and what we're going to have when we get there. It's just a good song to think about where the Lord is going to build our mansion. I doubt that we're going to be next door to Jesus, but it sounds good in a song anyhow, so you listen to the words. I have no castles, no earthly kingdom, but my cabin will do till I get home. My mansion's yonder on the hills of glory. Oh, I hope my mansion sits near the throne. Just build my mansion next door to Jesus and tell the angels I'm coming home. It doesn't matter who lives around me, just so my mansion sits near the throne. My mother's mansion may be close by me, across the golden avenue. She was the first one to teach me of heaven, and the very first one to tell me about you. Just build my mansion next door to Jesus and tell the angels I'm coming home. It doesn't matter who lives around me, just so my mansion sits near the throne. Well, I do appreciate you folks being here with us tonight. A little while ago, the parking lot was so empty, we had people trying to go back home. They didn't think we was going to have anything going on tonight, but I assured them that as good Baptists on a holiday, we're just getting done with our naps and everybody will be here just a little bit. Tonight, we're in the book of 2 Samuel, chapter number 11. I don't think that my wife, you did not get that ready, did you? Okay. I was going to play a little something to see if you could I was going to see who could pick out a tune. And then, of course, when you raise your hands, I would know that all of you listen to country music, but we didn't do that. 2 Samuel chapter 11. We'll read some verse here in a minute, but if you had your whole life to do all over again, and you could do one thing differently, what would it be? What do you think it'd be? And In my mind, I can almost guarantee that most of us it wouldn't be something that we did pretty good, but we'd like to do it better next time. I mean, that's all right. And you say, well, I did this, I was pretty good at this, but if I had my whole life to live over again, I'd do it. I don't think that'd be it. I think it would probably be something that we did very wrong, very bad, and we just wished we'd never done it at all. We could get that out of our life. And that's where we're at tonight in 2 Samuel chapter number 11. We've been studying the life of David. We've been trying to learn some life lessons from this king. And there's no question in my mind, if David could have done his life all over again, there's one thing he'd have done completely different. And I can sum that up in one word: Bathsheba. I don't think that would ever happen. He'd changed all that. But the fact is, you and I who've read the Bible, we've grown up in church, been around the Word of God a lot, when you hear the name David and you know David's story, there's two other names that always comes to your mind: Goliath and Bathsheba. And Goliath reminds us of David's greatest victory. Bathsheba reminds us of David's greatest defeat. Goliath was perhaps the highlight of his life. Bathsheba was definitely the low light of his life, his decisions. And if you think about it, no single sin outside of the sin of Adam and Eve in the garden, there's nothing that's got more coverage, more writing about, more attention than the sin of David with Bathsheba. And it's been repeated time and time again, right up to the present day. It's still being practiced by a lot of folks who, if they had that second chance, they said, boy, that was bad. And it's called different things today. Sometimes today they call it an affair, they call it a one-night stand, they call it a hookup, or whatever. It's all about Hollywood's favorite topic, sex outside of marriage. That's pretty well what they like to talk about. And this story has it all. That we're going to look at it here in just a little bit. It's got sex, it's got murder, it's got intrigue, it's got cover-up, and a king. You know the story, but a king, he has a one-night fling with another man's wife. He gets her pregnant, and then he has the other man killed to cover it up. In this day, in everything from the New York Times to Twitter to Facebook to whatever all the other things are they've got on the internet, they'd all been headlined something like the King's Spring Fling Uncovered. And it's amazing, really, when you read this story. Again, there's a lot more things I want to say about David. I may talk about him next Sunday morning, but there's a lot of things in his life. But when you read this, you just don't expect this chapter in the Bible. And you especially wouldn't expect it about David. You look at the first 10 chapters of 2 Samuel, he's batting 1,000. I mean, the guy's on top of everything. I'd say he's on top of his game. He's never been defeated in battle. That's something amazing in itself. You don't read that about anybody. He never lost a battle. His approval rating is 100% among his people. The economy's humming. This is what we always think about in election time. And so if we really hate somebody, and if they got the economy humming and all that, we find out another reason to hate them, because we think, I got to hate this person. But David had everything going for him. There was no unemployment. God was protecting Israel sort of like a blanket, and everybody knew that the hand of God was on this king. And now I don't know where they got all the numbers. I tried to find all this, but I'm told that he's now 50 years old. 50 years old seems young to me nowadays. In those days, it was starting to get a little bit old, but I would say he's still in the prime of his life, and he's been king now for about 20 years, and he's the nation. Think about this. He is his nation's number one songwriter. He's their number one soldier. He's been the chief of the most powerful army in the world. Every year he wins the most votes for the most admired person in Israel. That doesn't happen to anybody in leadership this day, but it happened to David. He's never been higher. He stands at the highest point of his life, actually in the highest position in the kingdom as king, and at the highest place in the city. He's on the rooftop of his house, which was a pretty high place, and he's got the whole world at his feet. And sadly, what we see from this story is the higher you are, the higher you get, the farther you can fall, and the worse it hurts. And that's what happens to David. What caused his fall can be boiled down to one simple fact. He said yes when he should have said no. Not to Bathsheba, to temptation. Now, we did have a fellow here that taught Sunday school a few years ago. I still laugh about it when I think about it, but he taught on David for several weeks. When he got done, it looked like David was an innocent bystander, and Bathsheba was the one that caused all the trouble. But that wasn't my doing. That was when Brother Price was pastoring, and he put somebody in there teaching that, and they didn't. I had some ladies get upset a little bit about that. They said, "My Lanza, he's making it look like David was a victim here." Well, David was not a victim, and the one time in his life that he should have run, he stood his ground, and it almost cost him his kingdom. And my title tonight is Lying Eyes, because his lying eyes got him in trouble. And I was going to have my wife, there's a song, we was coming home from the assisted living home. I almost said nursing home, I get in trouble for that. Assisted living home. We was coming home today, and I told her, I said, I'm going to use the title Lying Eyes. And I was trying to think of I said, somebody sang a song with that. So she started singing one to me. She said, "Your lying eyes will tell on you." I said, "No, that's not it. That's a cheating heart." Some of you older ones know that. Cheating heart will tell on you. So I never did figure out what. And so I come home and I Google it. You know what you do? I Google it, and up come, I forgot who sings it, but I told her, I said, play the first part of that, and I want to see how many people will raise their hand and tell me that I know what the name of that song is, but I didn't do it. But here's the fact. David convinced himself of a lie. Something that we have all convinced ourselves of at one time or another, and here's the lie. You can win at this game of sin. Because you can. No one ever has, and no one ever will. And we learn from this sad story of David's life what not to do when you're tempted, and then what not to do if you've already fallen and given in to that temptation. We're going to look at those things today. And so maybe, hopefully, for a lot of us in here today, this is what's called preventive medicine. This is something to keep me from getting myself in a mess later on, keeping me from getting off the wrong exit. For others, you say, "Preacher, I've already took the wrong exit." Well, then it can help us get on the right road and stay on the road once we get there. And so what do I do? How do I keep myself from getting in trouble when I'm tempted? Number one, I need to realize the appeal of sin. Now, they're not going to be up here today, so you're going to have to, if you want to write them down, you can, or just remember them. But think about it. I have to realize there is an appeal to sin. When I read this story, you just kind of have to ask, how in the world did a man after God's own heart, who had everything going for him, how did he get in such a mess to begin with? How's that happen? I see people today. I see preachers that's got themselves in mess, and I think, how did they get there? Well, look in verse number 1. He kind of gives us a clue. It says, I'm in 2 Samuel chapter 11. I think I told you that, but I might not have. Verse number 1 says, "It came to pass after the year was expired, at the time when kings go forth to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel. And they destroyed the children of Ammon and besieged Rabbah. But David tarried still at Jerusalem." The clue to what got David in trouble is that little word right there at the end, "but." You see, springtime, it's the end of the year, it's over, it's springtime. Springtime, they go to war. That's what they do. They're smart enough not to go out and fight in the wintertime, so when spring came, they go back out to whip around people and make sure they know who's in charge here. And so the countries go to war, and they were always led by their commander-in-chief. And for the first time, best I can tell, as I read through these stories and compared different things from here and in the book of Chronicles and the book of Kings, the first time ever, David doesn't go. Now, we went last year to somewhere and watched a play, and they showed how David was wore out and he was making so many decisions. It was a great thing, and I'd tell you what the name of it was, but I don't remember. Maybe it was just David. I don't know, but he didn't go, and I don't know all the reasons why he didn't go. But what happens is David is in the wrong place at the wrong time. Instead of being in the battle, he's home in bed. He's resting. If he'd been where he belonged, Bathsheba Gate would have never happened. Some of you get that here in a little bit. But while the other soldiers, they're out on the battlefield and fighting, David's home in bed sleeping. And it says in verse number 2, it says, "It came to pass." Now think about this. He's 50 years old. Now, I like a good nap, I'll be honest with you. Some people in here won't take them, I think their husband ought to make them take a nap, is what I think, but I won't mention any names, Cody. And in verse number 2, it says, "It came to pass in eventide that David arose from off his bed and walked upon the roof of the king's house, and from the roof he saw a woman washing herself, and the woman was very beautiful to look upon." So he takes this, he's 50 years old, he's taking a long afternoon nap, and now it's getting evening and he's bored. What am I going to do? I think I'll go up and walk on the roof. I don't think that would have crossed my mind, to be honest with you. I think I'd say, well, I'm already sleepy. I think I'll just stay right here and sleep some more. But he does this, and I'm told that kings frequently, they would build their bedrooms on the second story of their palace, and that way they could walk right out on what we would call today a patio. And we have a lot of people do that today. They didn't do it a whole lot in those days, just the kings. And then he could look down over the entire city, and he could see all of it, but he sees this woman bathing. And specifically, it says she was very beautiful. She was attractive. Physically, he was attracted to her. And again, it's a perfect picture of sin. My thought is, how am I going to keep from falling when temptation comes? One, I have to realize the appeal of sin. Could I tell you this evening, sin is appealing? Sin is attractive. There is pleasure in sin. If there wasn't, nobody'd do it. Satan knows that. And when somebody tries to tell you that there's no pleasure in sin, they're lying to you, because there's plenty of pleasure in it. But the Bible says the pleasure in sin is for a season. And I read a verse there today at the assisted living home that at the right hand of God there's pleasure forevermore. I like that forevermore pleasures more than a season of pleasure and then all kinds of torment after that. But David, he fell to this. And then he asks this question in verse 3. He says, and David sent and inquired after the woman. And one said, is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? Now again, you just read this, read through the story. It doesn't stand out too much to you, but I think there's something interesting here in the way this servant is trying to give David a little bit, I think, a warning, a word to the wise, you might say. I'm told that normally when you introduce someone in Israel in that day, you never mention their spouse. You would say, this is the son of David. He's a son of Jesse. Who's David's wife? Well, they could have named 4 or 5 of them, but they didn't. Said David, the son of Jesse. You go to other people, the son of so-and-so or the daughter of so-and-so. But here, this servant, he makes a point of saying she is the wife of Uriah the Hittite. It's sort of like he was a servant, so he's trying to be real nice about it and saying, hey, you need to back off, Bubba, she's married. And so that's what he's trying to tell the king in a nice way and not getting in trouble. But there's something else to that. Could I tell you this? If you're a child of God and you're about to walk off that cliff of temptation and fall into the valley of sin, God's going to send you a warning. He always does. He'll let you know. No one has ever fallen into sin and said, man, I had no idea. It was just a surprise. I didn't even know this was sin. No, he knew. And he knew what he was getting into. God always turns the light red. He always lets you know. And I was reading about the Secret Service. I thought it was interesting how they protect the president, and they've got what they call it their sixth sense. They say the greatest asset that they bring to the table is relying on their instinct and their training. Now, I don't know anybody in the Secret Service, but I'm told that they're at the very top. I mean, they're the best, and they have the ability to anticipate danger and to take very quick preventative action over most anybody else you will ever see. And I was reading this. It said no matter how sound or how technically advanced their equipment and their protective techniques might be, no matter how large the safety zone that they put around the president, no matter, regardless how many bulletproof vests they have and guns and good intelligence, this article said it's their reflexes, the skills at that moment of danger that makes the biggest difference between whether or not a president lives or dies. You know, we've not had a lot of presidents killed. We had some, but not a lot. And I bet there's a whole lot of people like to. But a lot of them, you don't read all the stories, but a lot of people has been stopped and other things. So God does that. He gives us warning, just like these people. And God gives us a conscience. We've all got one. Now, you cannot completely rely on your conscience because you can train your conscience wrong. If you train your conscience that certain things are right and they're not right, then your conscience will never bother you. So you have to be careful of that. But he gives us that conscience. And if you're saved, he's also giving you the Spirit of God. He's moved in. He lives there. We talked about that in Sunday school this morning. And God puts up the gates across the railroad track. I mean, he does everything. He sounds the alarm. He turns on the red light. He does everything to keep us from crossing the line. But David doesn't listen. David knew what he was doing. He takes a fatal step that will lead him over that cliff of temptation into the valley of tragedy. Verse 4 says, and David sent messengers and took her. And she came in unto him, and he lay with her, for she was purified from her uncleanness, and she returned unto her house. Now, this is a part of the story where when if you read it for the very first time, you kind of want to hit stop on the tape. You know, the old VCR tapes or the old whatever them little things are, cassette tape. You want to hit stop right there. And you just want to stop it and kind of holler at David, David, don't do this. If you had any idea what's coming, and go watch ESPN, go turn on the TV, go play a game, go take a cold shower, but don't do what you're about to do. That's what you want to do, but we can't do it. And if you know the story of David, you realize this: David didn't know what you and I know. What if David had known ahead of time that this one night is going to cause me to lose 4 of my children? Because of his sin, if you read through the story, eventually he lost 4 children because of his sin. And he also, his kingdom was split in half, and it made him a murderer in the first degree. This night, he wasn't thinking about, well, after tonight, I'll probably have to murder her husband. He wasn't thinking that. That's what happened. And what my thought is, when you come face to face with the appeal of sin, there's only one good remedy. You run. Now, we don't think about this in anything else, but when you're tempted to do wrong, if you fight, you're going to lose. If you run, you win. I mean, I read several places in the Bible where we're told in the Bible to flee fornication, flee any kind of sexual immorality. It's in there several times. But I got to look at, I can't find where it ever says flee gluttony. Gluttony, doesn't say it. Flee gossip, doesn't say that. Flee lying, doesn't say it. We stand and we fight against those things, and we under the power of the Spirit of God, we resist them, and we don't do those things, but we're told to flee immorality. It says run. And instead of running to God and away from sin, David ran to sin and he ran away from God. And the results is catastrophic. Again, my thought is, what do I do? How do I keep from believing my lying eyes? Well, I have to realize sin has a great appeal, but I can't believe it. Number 2, if I do fall, if I do fail, and we all do sometime, I have to refuse to conceal that sin. David goes to bed that night. I can imagine him thinking, well, I got away with it. Nobody knows what happened. No harm, no foul. Nobody's going to know it. Seemed like a pretty good evening for me. And that went on for a few weeks. And then David was going to learn that one night stand, you could say, it's going to turn into a lifetime of misery. And I can show you a lot of people today that are still living the lifetime of misery because of the one night of foolishness, one night of giving in. And so one day there's a knock on his door, and it's a message that Bathsheba sent to David. Verse 5 says, and the woman conceived and sent and told David and said, I am with child. Now, best I can tell, this is the only thing I see Bathsheba say in this whole little story here, the whole narrative. I don't see her saying anything else. But that's 4 more words than David ever wanted to hear her say. He didn't want to hear those words. And those words shook him. And again, you want to hit that stop button on the tape. And you want to say, David, you've made a mess of things, but you need to confess it. You need to tell God you're sorry. You need to confess it to God. You need to confess it to Bathsheba. You need to confess it to her husband. And what that will do is that'll stop the bleeding. Now, there's still going to be trouble, but it'll stop the bleeding. And the problem would have been contained to an act of adultery and a pregnancy outside of wedlock. Most likely, they could have, Uriah and his wife could have got the wedding, the marriage rebuilt. They could have fixed things. Lives could have been saved. Relationships could have been restored. But instead, what so many do, instead of fessing up, he starts covering up. He starts hiding. Now, again, my whole thought tonight is on lying eyes. David thinks he can get by with something. This is one of the greatest men in the Bible. A man the Bible says is after God's own heart, and yet he can fall. I know people today say, well, those things would never happen to me. There is no way that any of us are anywhere close to as great as David was, and it happened to him. It can happen to any of us. And so I'm not going to read the entire narrative, which it would probably be faster again, but I'll kind of summarize it. But David sends for Uriah. He's got a plan. He tells him to come home. He comes home, and David, how's the war going? Now, can you imagine, wouldn't you right away suspect something? If you're one of the better soldiers and you're out there fighting, and the king calls for you to come home, and you come home, and he said, hey, how's things going? You said, what in the world you call me home to ask me that for? Bring home one of them other guys. But he asks him how he is, how things are going, and then he tells him, go home see your wife. And he gives him a gift to try and encourage him to have a good time with his wife, but he didn't go home. Uriah won't do it. And instead he sleeps on the door of the palace with the king's servants. When David asked him why he didn't go home, it's almost like, without knowing it, he sticks a knife right in David's heart. Because in effect what he said is, how can I go home and enjoy intimacy with my wife when my fellow soldiers are out there fighting? What do you think David thought about that, since it wasn't even his wife, and he's been doing that exact same thing? And so he didn't, I don't think Uriah had any idea what he was saying, but I think it was a wake-up call for David, but it didn't wake him up. He's still not confessing. Again, my thought is, what do I do if I do fall? Well, you need to refuse to conceal that sin. The worst thing you can do in life is decide, I've messed up, so I'm going to cover it up. And so David, he's still trying, so he invites him, hey, stay over another night, hoping he's going to go home. He doesn't go home again. Sleeps outside there again. So he comes up with one last idea. Come on, have dinner with me. Come have supper. And he gets him drunk. And he thought this will loosen him up, but it didn't. In fact, at the moment, Uriah proved to be a better man when he was drunk than David was sober. We don't see that much about Uriah, but that's the type of man he was. And again, he slept there on the doorstep. And now David, a man after God's own heart, gets as far away from the heart of God as you can possibly get. And he sends Uriah back to the front lines with a letter to Joab, the commander. And he says, put him up in the toughest part of the battle and then withdraw around him. What's that? It'd be like sending my 40 best guys up here, and 39 of you, I want you, after you get up there and get started real good, I want you guys just kind of fade away, leave him standing. We do that in the choir sometimes. We find somebody that we want to really embarrass, we just all quit singing and leave them. Well, this is what he did. They just pulled back, and so he would die. And Joab knew that. And so what happened was Uriah carried his own death sentence to the battlefield. What if he'd opened that? I often thought of that. What if he'd been like David, not really trustworthy? He'd opened that. Man, I'm not doing that. Look at that letter. I'm not doing that. I'm going to go back and whoop the kings, what I'm going to do. He didn't do any of that. And so Job carries out the orders. It says in verse 16, it came to pass when Joab observed the city that he assigned Uriah into a place where he knew that valiant men were. And the men of the city went out and fought with Joab. And there fell some of the people of the servants of David, and Uriah the Hittite died also. Now here's what I want you to notice in this. Who died? Did Uriah die? Sure, that's what David had planned. But it also says some of the other soldiers died too. Somebody else was affected by David's sin. Somebody else was affected by David's decision. A lot of innocent people paid the price for David's sin, because that's who really gets hurt when you and I get our lives messed up and head in the wrong direction. It's innocent people. And this was some innocent people that got killed here. And just in case you think, well, I do these things, but nobody gets hurt when I break God's law, could I tell you, it always hurts God, because it's his law. And he knows what we're doing. And here, what David did with Bathsheba was, I call it a sin of passion in the heat of the moment. What David did to Uriah was just cold-blooded sin. There was no compassion. There was no passion. There was just planning. I'm going to make things work for me. It's going to cost him his life. That's just the way it is. We have to do that. That's how far away from God he's gotten. And remember this, when you give in to temptation and you take the wrong road, you got two choices. You can either confess what you did, or you can conceal what you did. One, if you decide one, it's going to begin to dig you out of the hole. You decide the other, it's going to get you in deeper. Somebody wrote a little poem. I wrote it down here. It says, when you tell one lie, it leads to another. So you tell two lies to try and cover. Then you tell three lies, and oh brother, you're in trouble up to your ears. Well, that's sort of what happens. And he's there. But here's what's amazing. He thought he was covered up, but I know about it. I'm 3,000 years down the road, and I know what he did. He didn't get it covered up. It covered up here for a little while, but we're still talking about it. And David himself is the one that wrote it down later on for millions of people to read, because he knew they would. And easily this is one of the most famous stories in the entire Bible. But the whole purpose is that God had him write it after he sinned, after he confessed, which he did, and you can read that later. But after he finally got right with God, it took him a year. He wrote this so we could understand and remember that covering your sin will always cost you more than confessing your sin. So Some of you think, preacher, this is Memorial Weekend. What are we doing? I don't know. I'm on the life of David. This is where I got to. So I got a better story for next Sunday morning about David and Mephibosheth. It's a great story, and so we're going to talk about that. But I call this one the Lion Eye. So what do? Well, I need to, first of all, realize that sin has a great appeal. That'll help me to take a stand against it. And then if I do fail, I pray that we don't fail, but if we do fail, don't try to conceal it. Confess it. Get that thing taken care of right away. And then we need to remember that God's going to bring the sin out. He's going to reveal it. When news gets to David that Uriah is dead, in my mind, I think David's just kind of cold-hearted. He says in verse 25, then David said to the messenger, thus shalt thou say unto Joab, let not this thing displease thee, for the sword devoureth one as well as another. Make the battle more strong against the city and overthrow it, and encourage thou him. What's he saying? Well, I know they sent message back to David, hey, Uriah is dead. Well, that's the way it goes sometimes. It's the way the cookie crumbles. Sometimes, you sign up for war, you sign up to be a soldier, that's a chance you're taking. Those things might happen and if you volunteer for the army, and that's how cold-hearted he was. That's how far away from God David is, a man after God's own heart. And then you go on and read the story, Bathsheba, she mourns, and then he brings her to the palace. He marries her thinking, okay, everybody's going to live happily ever after now because they're all going to think that this was his son, and I'm just marrying her because her husband's dead. And he convinced himself that he has gotten away with it, but he forgot something. Nobody does. God's not going to allow it. And in fact, there's one statement at the end of this that tells me why he didn't get away with it, and why he couldn't get away with it, because nobody ever gets away with it. In verse 27, it says, when the morning was past, David sent and fetched her to his house, and she became his wife, and bare him a son. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. Don't ever say nobody will ever know, or nobody will ever find out, because God always knows. And things would have worked out fine had God not seen it, but he did. A lot of crimes that's committed in this world, they'd be perfect crimes if the Lord didn't see it. We'd probably all get away with things like lying and stealing and cheating and murder if God didn't see it. But he always sees it, and he always knows. Think about this world that we live in right now. You can't go anywhere. I mean, even if you're innocent, you're guilty. They got so many cameras, they can find an angle and make you look guilty. And they do that. And I would hate to be a policeman today. I don't think they probably make very much money. Their life is always on the line. And if you try to stop somebody, you have to answer to why you touched them. They're pointing a gun at your face and all this. And we have those they watch us everywhere, the video cameras, and we've got all kinds of data that can identify where you've been. Our cell phones track us, that your every movement. And some of you, I probably shouldn't tell this, but some of you know this. You can find where your kids are. You can put it on their phone. You can track them, and they don't know that. I won't tell anybody that, but it is possible. And then we got these satellites up there. They can photograph. I substituted on a mail route. I had a lady call over there at the post office one day. She was complaining. Nobody put the package here, and I told you where I wanted the package and all this. So they went showed a picture of me laying it right there on her front step. She called me several choice names too. I won't repeat any of those to you, but the fact was I don't know who took her package, but I put it inside her gate right exactly where she told me to. And but everything is there. You're followed. But think about this: you're much more known by an omnipotent, omnipresent, all-seeing God. He knows everything that's going on. He knows what you're even thinking. They can't get that on there yet. They can't figure out what you're thinking, but he knows everything we do wrong, and he doesn't forget until we make it right. And there's no statute of limitations with God. In this world, you do things, and they can't do anything about it. That was 7 years ago or 6 years ago. Well, there's no statute of limitations with God. What you cover, God's going to uncover. But if you uncover it, what's that mean? I confess it. God said, I'll take care of it. It's forgiven. It's covered in the blood. So at any moment, here's my thought, at any moment through this story, David could have sought forgiveness, and God would have said, you're forgiven. But he didn't. Could I tell you this? God is always willing to forgive and to forget. But he's not going to forget until he forgives. So if you don't confess, it's still out there. I've had people say, well, you know what, I did this 10 years ago and I cheated this guy. What should I do? Well, you cheated him 10 years ago. You ought to make it right today. You know it. He knows it. It's still wrong. And a lot of people think I'm crazy when I say those things, but there is no statute of limitation with God. I don't. If you stole something from somebody 10 years ago, you still owe it to them. And you say, well, I can't pay it back. Go back and apologize and let them know what you did. Let them know you recognize you was wrong. I think the Bible teaches that. And God forgives when we confess our sin and repent of our sins. And so David, he goes for 12 months. And he never tried to get forgiveness, never tried to get things right. And in the span of about a month, I got to listen. He's knocked off 6 of God's commandments. He's coveted another man's wife. He's committed adultery. Then he murdered this man. Then he stole his wife. Then he lied about it. And he dishonored his family. This is a man after God's own heart. I am emphasizing this because none of us in our mind think anything like this could ever happen to us. And I could name you a lot of people that are much better people than I am, and many others that have fallen into things like this, and they just didn't pay attention. They didn't think that Satan could overcome them. And in chapter 12, we're not going to go there tonight, but David had to learn a lesson the hard way, that what you conceal, God's going to reveal it. But if you'll reveal it, then God will conceal it. That's the best way to do it. Confess it. It's going to hurt. It's going to cost you some things, but not near as much it'll cost if you don't. And you see, the reason why God sent his son to die on the cross is so we could be forgiven of any sin, even adultery, even murder. If we're willing to confess sin and ask forgiveness for it and repent of sin, God said, I'll do it. Now, I'm about done, but I want this show you how much God cares for people. When I read that story of David, if I didn't know how great a person he was, I think he's a dirtbag. But he's not. He's a great man of God who was a man after God's own heart. But years later, after David died, one of his descendants, a fellow by the name of, it says Elijah, but it's with an A, is the way I got it spelled. But he became king of Judah. He was no good. I mean, he was wicked. But God made sure that he had a godly son to follow him to keep Jerusalem strong. Why would he do that? He didn't do it for Elijah. He did it for David. In fact, here's what the Bible says in 1 Kings chapter 15. It says, nevertheless, for David's sake did the Lord his God give him a lamp in Jerusalem to set up his son after him and to establish Jerusalem. Why? Because David did that which was right in the eyes of the Lord and turned not aside from anything that he commanded him all the days of his life, save only in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. Can you imagine that? David was a man, he lost 4 sons because of his sin, but the truth is that's really the only time he ever sidestepped God. The only time in his life. He could have had a perfect record except for Uriah the Hittite. Now let me tell you this, none of us are going to make it. None of us are going to die with a perfect record. Some of us are not even very close right now. But I tell you what, it would be nice. We can't die blameless. What's that mean? I just get it all taken care of. I get it confessed. I ask God to forgive me. I take all the things I've messed up. And with the help of the Holy Spirit, this could be said about us, that we did that which was right in the eyes of the Lord and turned not aside from anything that he commanded him all the days of his life. We can start right now. Say, you know what? I'm going to follow God. Oh, there'll be some failures along the way, but we can have things said about us like that. David, if you ask me, you can't get much worse. You can't fail much worse than what David did. And yet David is one of the heroes of the Bible and a man that God himself says he was after his own heart. We can be that. Don't trust your eyes. Lion eyes. I don't even know why I give it that title, but it was a good title because David was convinced he could do something that he can't do. And no one ever has, and no one ever will get by with sin. It's not going to happen. You may think you're the exception, but I can guarantee you, you're not the exception. Nobody gets by with it. Would you bow with me for prayer? Father, again, we love you. We thank you for your word tonight. God, sometimes it's not good medicine. It doesn't seem like good medicine. It's not very tasty, but God, it's needed. There's a lot of things in your word that we need. And God, we know that Satan's out here, and the temptations he sends our way may not be in the line of immorality, but there's others. There's other areas that he comes after us, and God, we still need to know that there is pleasure in sin, and so we need to understand that just because it seems pleasurable, it may not be right. And we need to see those things. And then, God, sometimes we do fail, and sometimes we do fall. And I pray you give us the courage to realize I'm not going to cover this up and make things worse. I'm going to confess it. I'm going to get back on my feet, and I'm going to go on like I ought to. Difficult things, but God, we know that you're going to bring it out in the open. So it'd be much easier for us to confess it so you can cover it up. God, again, I don't know the reason why you wanted this sermon tonight, but God, I pray you'll help us tonight. I pray that you'll help us to respond the way we ought to, and most of all, God, help us to stand and be careful about temptation.